This show is a part of the FM Podcast Network, the home of great music podcasts. Visit us at fmpods.com.
Hello and welcome to the third episode of Infinity Goes Up on Trial. I'm your host, Erin Callahan, and today I'm with Laura Tenschert, who I'm so excited is my first female guest, and this is my first international shoot, and my first shoot without the incredibly talented crew. So we did the setup ourselves, and I'm really proud of us. So thank you so much for helping me out.
Thank you for coming all the way to London.
I'm so happy to
just
be here.
For this interview. Just kidding.
That's part of it, but yeah, to see the Yoko Ono exhibit and to hang out with you and talk with you, and I'm so grateful to you for doing this. So let me tell you, if you don't know who Laura is, I think you've been living under a rock for a few years, but Laura is a leading voice in contemporary Dylan studies. She is the creator of Definitely Dylan. So she serves on the boards of the Institute of Bob Dylan Studies at the University of Tulsa and the Dylan Review. She earned her MA in Comparative Literary Studies from Goldsmiths University in London, and she has a chapter in the book Court Carney and I edited, brilliant chapter, on Dylan's set lists, and one on Dylan giving himself to the muse in Dylan at 80. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm here with you, so it's not like you came to me, I came to you, so thank you for having me. You also have presented at numerous conferences on Dylan's work, and we're about to present next week, and we can say that next week, so this won't air before the conference, and we're not giving away any secrets, but on Bob Dylan Questions on Masculinity, where we're looking at Bob Dylan's masculine performance. So welcome. Thank you for being my first guest. So let's jump right in and talk about, we had a conversation a while back where you said that Dylan isn't a figure traditionally idealized or that represents a traditionally idealized masculinity. And but he seems really confident and comfortable in his performance of masculinity. So let's talk about that.
Well, one thing that I've been thinking about in the lead up to this conference next week is, so I've been reading a lot of his interviews in addition to listening to his music and reading his books and so on. And it occurred to me that I think partly what we do is, we see Bob Dylan as a man, and we almost like read his life as a text, because he has gone through all these different phases and so on. But I think one of the challenges is also, he is a real person. He is he is a human being. Right. And I think, so it's almost like you read the masculinity and how he sings about it in his songs and how he presents it in his work, and then look at him as a person. Yeah. And I mean, for one, that must be like a very weird position to be in. Like every once in a while, I think, like, what does it feel like to be Bob Dylan and to have these people, talk about your life as well as your art
with such excruciating focus.
Yeah, I know.
And then also he's so separate from who he is as a human being, as you say, and we look at that in terms of who he is as a father and the different performances of his masculinity, but then we separate that from the work, and he is performing a character of Bob Dylan. And so I always think about how it must feel to be, for most of your adult or all of your adult life, when you walk into the room, you suck all of the energy in that room, and people want to be near you or talk to you or figure or ask you questions because they think you have the answer. And so it must be exhausting.
Yeah
So I think just his height and his weight, his stature, his physical stature, when we were in Austin and we were so close, so lovely, I kept looking at his legs and how tiny his legs were, and just thinking about he is a small person. And so I wonder, like, you said he's always been so confident in his sexuality and his performance of masculinity, and where do you think that comes from? Because he's not a traditional, the representation of what we think of, hyper masculine.
Well, I mean, I think that where the confidence initially comes from, I hope he had a lot of support growing up.
I loved him very much.
Yeah, exactly. But beyond that, I mean, I think he has enjoyed success pretty, at a really young age, and he, I think, has a lot of confidence in what he does, and I think that radiates out, and that's why I think people are drawn to him, because I think he's so self-assured as a performer, or at least, I mean, when he steps out on stage, I mean, I don't know what he's like off stage, but I think like as soon as he steps out on stage, like he knows, and he's spoken about that several times through the years, and we know this, of course, as his, audience, that he knows he's good at what he does.
Right.
And I think there's just something very magnetic about that kind of confidence that comes from doing what you... he's spoken about how he feels like this is what he's in this world to do. This is
the aspect of fate or destiny.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Going towards his destiny.
Yeah, and I think that's, I think that is what we find very, attractive in the most literal sense.
I think it too is like it's this interesting dichotomy or binary between sort of the physical concept of masculinity as being, tall and muscular and whatnot, but also his intelligence to me is what is where he maybe tends to not dominate, but be, a little bit more, I guess, dominant, because he is far smarter than I could ever pretend to be.
Very witty.
Yeah, witty and
witted. Yeah.
Yeah, with that, and just his language, his wordplay, and things like that. And I always think that maybe that's where it comes from. That it's not a traditional sense of, that type of masculinity. But there's so much confidence early on, and I think we've talked about this, where you see him pictured with women, and that famous picture of Joan Baez lifting him up. And that's, an inversion, or women cradling him and holding him, or sitting on women's laps. And so his performance seems to be counter to what we would consider traditional.
You could almost argue that it seems like he isn't performing.
Right.
It's almost he just is. And I mean, as much as you can ever not perform, but it does feel like. And again, this goes back to the confidence, that he doesn't feel like he needs to assert himself and like be a strong, masculine male, but that he can just give himself to a certain dynamic. And I mean, with Joan Baez, I mean, she has often spoken about how she just wanted to mother him.
Yes.
And
Susie Rodolo too, that he needed a lot of mothering. And I think Roberto and I were talking about that this morning, that he seems like someone who needs to be cared for a lot.
Well, and also, I mean, I've been, even in his songs, I mean, I've been thinking about that.
Okay, let's talk about the songs.
Well, in the lead up to the conference, that I think, especially in his early songs, he's so like forcefully rejecting the traditional ideals of masculinity, and he says, I don't want to be the strong guy, and even like in It Ain't Me, Babe, he is, I mean, whether he's talking in general or just about this specific relationship, but he's basically saying, like, I don't want to be like just your savior. I don't want to be like the guy who's like the lover for your life. And I think that was a quite new at the time. And even, I know that was like partly inspired by his own experience, but he wrote a couple of songs where, he's being left by the woman. I'm thinking of Boots of Spanish Leather, she's sailing away. And I think that that's kind of a twist on the traditional tale where the man goes out. And then later on, he wrote plenty of songs where it's the other way around as well.
Right. Well, Roberta and I were talking about this morning, about Susie Rodolo, how she had such a sense, I'm going to shift a little bit to a feminist perspective, but it does maybe influence the way he's responding, because you talked about Boots of Spanish Leather, and I was thinking of Tomorrow's a Long Time. But she realized early on that her role was not to support him, that she had her own pathway in life. And maybe that relationship, being really one of his first serious relationships, was foundational in how he viewed women. And I was thinking of All I Really Want to Do,
I ain't looking to compete with you.
Yeah, he just wants to be friends with that person and with the woman, and it's a platonic relationship that it's maybe.
I mean,
and maybe he wants to sleep with her and keep it. Yeah, maybe there's a bit of.
Well, I mean, I think I do think that it's telling that that's on the same album as It Ain't Me, Babe.
Right.
So I mean, and you can also maybe see it in the context of what was happening in the 60s, and. I mean, I would say, maybe he was thinking about non-traditional relationships that don't immediately end in marriage, but then soon after he did get married and start a family.
Right.
But I think that it's certainly. I think I've been thinking about that song as well, about how it is about him wanting to meet her kind of on the same level.
Right.
And I think. I mean, Susie Rodelo, I love her book, and I think the way that she writes about their time together is all the more interesting because you get her perspective as a whole person, and therefore you can really see not just what the time was like, but also what drew him to her, and how the two kind of work together. And I mean, obviously we only have a limited view on his personal life or whatever, but I always had the feeling that he's drawn to strong women, that he's that he appreciates when a woman has her own mind and her own life, and I think that shines through in the songs as well.
Do you think you felt that way about Sarah?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think everyone was talking about how she was really she was the one who introduced him to Donna Pennebaker, which I think is often not mentioned, because everyone. I mean, I've spoken about this in other places before, but I think that Dylan writing thus far has done Sarah really dirty, because everywhere, the mostly male writers it's always Sarah Dillon, a former Playboy bunny. Because she worked in the Playboy Club for a short spell, years before she met Dylan. But I think it kind of frames it as he went for this meek model who was.
Is it all the male writers, or is it a particular male writer?
It's several actually.
Okay,
It's not just one.
No, I'm not disagreeing, but I was thinking of other representations of the female writers that you've written about, or the female, the backup vocalists, or who are shrill. Or
The
descriptions.
We know who you're talking about.
Right, but so I'm thinking, but it's reductive because it does just frame her as a sexual object, or so it doesn't tell the full story of her.
Well, I think it's also because we have a book that was written by Susie. Sarah has always stayed out of the spotlight, that's her choice,
right.
And but that also means that she's become this canvas that people just project something onto. We don't really know her, we don't really know her character, we don't really know her full story,
right.
And I think some people have mistaken that for passiveness, or that she is basically just was just this kind of meek and mild wife and mother that would stay at home. But
he was also at home. That's part of my paper, that he was also at home during that period.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an interesting perspective that they were living sort of a domestic life, so people will place her automatically. And also that reads for the time period, even though we're in Equal Rights Amendment era, that we're looking at her through the framework of domesticity, that her role was to get married and raise children and have children. And she did have quite a few in a short period of time, so God bless. But, but I think that there...
But even that isn't everything that defines a woman,
Exactly. Yes, we're having that conversation in America right now because of the comments that the place kicker for the Chiefs made. That the role, the most fulfilling role a woman has is wife and mother, that their lives will begin when their wives...
It's a bad thing to say for a man.
Right.
Yeah.
But it reinforces the whole role of patriarchy, that a woman is there just to make men's lives easier and to support what men are doing. And I think that that's not been part of the discussion because people are so outraged, but I wonder if Sarah did fulfill part of that role, that she was there to make Dylan's life easier.
Yeah, I'm sure, because at some point he was able to head out on tour again, and
or even escape to the Big Pink on a daily basis, just turn up and play with his guy friends.
Yeah.
So we talked about this, I think, in the Dylan Taunts, the criticism, and you push back against the criticism on Just Like a Woman, and I do want to talk about that, because that's where people are like, that's where he's misogynistic, and I don't know, maybe if it's more his treatment of Joan Baez that I would say is maybe not misogynistic, but not entirely generous. But will you tell us a little bit more, and maybe some other lyrics that you found as you've been preparing for the conference, and maybe even for our talk, that you were like, this is, kind of him sussing out or reconciling his identity, gender identity.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've been thinking about that as well. There's this conference coming up about Dylan and masculinity, and we can't help but talk about femininity,
right?
Because the two work together. And I mean, I think that's completely understandable. And the two kind of, I mean, it's a yin and yang thing, and I mean, I am fascinated with that, and I really, it's interesting to see how that has shifted over the course of his career as he has moved on from young man to married man, father, divorcee, and it's of course, because we all grow and we all evolve. And I think at the moment, just from social media, I get the impression that there's a big moment at the moment where a lot of young people are really discovering Joan Baez and her importance in culture. And there's this documentary that's come out recently, I'm a Noise, which I think is fantastic, and she's getting her due, and she's being photographed with Lana Del Rey and Boy Genius and whatever, so it's all
and
great.
Justin Jones,
yes, exactly, yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I'm so pleased to see that, and I hope that continues as well. But I think it also kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of people being, saying like, oh, Bob Dylan's so annoying, he treated her so badly, and so on. And I understand all of that, but I sometimes also think like, I mean, maybe people will say like, oh, you're just defending him because, you have a Dylan podcast or whatever. But it kind of goes back to this idea that he is a real person.
Right.
And I don't think anyone should be defined by, the worst thing they've done. And, I don't know if treating Joan Baez that way is the worst thing he's ever done. I don't know, but you know what I mean. And I think it's interesting to see. And I'm worried I'm going to completely, of course, from your question, but
go where it takes you.
But I think in general, like I think it's interesting to see how his treatment of women has kind of like evolved over the years, and with Just Like a Woman. I mean, we don't know who that song is about,
right.
And I understand that there's always like a big temptation to be like, oh, this song hits harder when I think I know that it's inspired by a real relationship.
Does it need to?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't think so.
I don't either.
Yeah, but I think like for a lot of people, it's easier to just slip into a song when you think you understand the interpersonal dynamic behind it.
But the autobiographical or the biographical reading, to me, it's important, but I say this all the time, but it's not the most interesting reading for me, because there's so much more going on in the song and the dynamics of the song.
And if it's a good song, it will transcend the autobiographical inspiration anyway,
right.
Because, you sometimes, if you write something like a song for the sake of it being a good song, then sometimes you have to make changes, you have to like take some license, and I mean, I think a really good example for that is like a Rolling Stone, which a lot of people say was written about Edie Sedgwick.
Yes.
And I mean, I don't know what the relationship was like. I don't think there's actually any real evidence that they had like a romantic relationship. Like they obviously knew each other, but
right.
But to me, the moment when he wrote Like a Rolling Stone was a moment where there were so many changes going on in his life.
Right.
he had shot to fame, and he was really trying to figure out where he was going next. And I mean, he's spoken in interviews about how Like a Rolling Stone was a big turning point for him as a writer, as an artist. And it's this song about someone who is thrown out on their own, and in a situation that they now have to, figure out how to navigate, right? And so to me, it's like it's so clear that this is a song that he is like also writing to himself. And then I think it's interesting when people, I mean, there's a book called Under My Thumb, songs that hate women and the women who love them, and it has an entire chapter on how sexist or how misogynist Like a Rolling Stone is. And I personally don't really see it as that. And additionally, I think to also add, Like a Rolling Stone, even if it was a direct attack at a woman, I think to then say, oh, and because he writes a song about one woman, it's misogynist, because the same album has Ballad of a Thin Man, and no one says he hates all men because he's criticizing one man.
Right. I think it's interesting. There's so many thoughts. I always read so many things. So many. No, but I'm just like, and I'm not taking notes. So let's hope as jet lagged as I am, that I can get it all straight. But I think I've always read it. Maybe I love that reading, that it's him kind of going out, because he's also writing positively for a street, and like there's a lot going on in that period where he's leaving the safety of the folk community and going on. But I always read it as an indictment of the college kids in the folk scene, the people who grew up with affluence, maybe a little bit of the new lefters who weren't so as committed, that how does it feel to like they don't really have the moral, I don't know if it's the morals or the commitment to the cause. It's almost a performance.
But I mean, that's what makes it a great song, right? There are so many angles, and I think even the question, how does it feel, it completely depends on the tone with which you read that question. It can be a scornful, how does it feel, throwing it in someone's face, or it can be said with real empathy, how does it feel? And what makes it a great song is that depending on the mood that you're in, the frame of mind that you're in, the frame of mind that the performer's in, it can shift, and
as it does with Dylan.
Exactly.
And so I think too, like there was in his Kurt Loder interview in 1984 when he talks about the motorcycle accident and the period before it. So we're talking about Like a Rolling Stone, and he says, I was working for all of these leeches. And so maybe we can read that, how does it feel, that it's also liberating to be on your own.
Definitely. I mean, I think the fact that No Direction Home has become such a big phrase that we that we associate with Bob Dylan, that's the name of the Scorsese documentaries. And so and actually, like, you said this to me, I think in the Dylan Tans interview, maybe where you mentioned that Don't Look Back comes from a song, She Belongs to Me, which is written at a woman.
Right.
And this is,
it was Behind the Shades, because it was being critical of the girl with me behind the shades. And but also Don't Look Back. She's got everything she needs. She's an artist. She don't look back. And the same, I think around that time in the 60s, and at some point I thought that's maybe what I want to be talking about at the conference, and then I shifted. But I'm really fascinated with that time in the early to mid 60s, where he writes a lot of songs addressed to women that are kind of like speaking about his own experience. And I think It's All Over Now, Baby Blue is a really big one as well. Again, this is a time where he is trying to figure stuff out. I came across this interview from 1964, I think with Melody Maker in the UK, where he's being asked about his sudden success, and he says, like all these people are liking my songs now, which makes me think maybe I'm not doing it right. And then he says, man, I'm going through a weird time. Oh, that's great.
And that, when I read that, it seemed like such a vulnerable moment where he is like really saying, this is difficult. This is difficult. It's difficult to all of a sudden have all these expectations on you and like to try and figure out where you're taking it from there. And I mean, this is really something that he is figuring out constantly. I mean, he's figuring that in 64, 65, 66, and then with the motorcycle accident, there's such a big shift. And then it's, you know, all of a sudden he needs to figure out a completely new stage in his life.
Right. That's where my paper comes in.
Yeah, exactly. And then really, I mean, at some point, it seems like he almost like realizes that being an artist means you constantly have to figure it out. And
well, he says that being an artist, he says that in the Scorsese documentary, means that you're never at a place where you think you've arrived somewhere.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the irony is almost that he had that figured out kind of like from the beginning, but you have to like keep committing to that, because he thinks he's not busy being born, is busy dying, you know. So it was already there, and like a lot of that what he was talking about or singing about early on, and I think that characterizes so many moments in his career, and like even like the, you know, the performances, like different bands, different arrangements. But to quickly take it back to the songs that he writes addressed to women, because another big one is To Ramona, and it really feels like in that song and in It's All Over Now Baby Blue, it's almost like he has learned a life lesson and he puts that in song, but then he addresses it to a woman.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting.
That's an interesting paper in itself about sort of masking his own experiences through the feminine, you know, through the feminine.
Well, I have a couple of days, maybe I will, you know, change my topic again.
Can you imagine? But I think that's part of it, because I told you that I blew my paper up, and then the other night Court sent me a text. I think it was Wednesday night. I'm thinking of blowing my paper up. And I think it's so wonderful about Dylan that you think you're certain about a direction you're going, and then you get to that and you're like, well, maybe I want to do this other thing.
Yeah.
And he gives us so much to play with. David Haydu gave a paper at Dylan and the Beats, and he talked about It's All Over Now Baby Blue in terms of Dylan leaving the folk scene. Take what you think will last, you know, and sort of it's his farewell, but really kind of he deconstructed it in such a beautiful way that.
Well, now it was the last song in Shadow Kingdom as well. I mean, I think Shadow Kingdom beginning with When I Paint My Masterpiece and ending with It's All Over Now Baby Blue, I think that's it's almost like an artist statement.
Right.
You know, you have to keep being in pursuit of what's next and leave the stepping stones behind. You know, I think that's beautiful, and I think that's, I mean, I've probably thought more about that choice than he has.
It also goes with like a Rolling Stone. If we're talking about how does it feel to be on your own, when you're leaving the stepping stones behind, you kind of are on your own.
Exactly. And I mean, I think the idea of like being a complete unknown, I think that's a big theme that I see in his songs as well. That one of the things that comes up again and again in the love songs, in the songs of kind of courting or like writing to a romantic, like a love interest, like a lover, is this idea of knowing one another. And, you know, I mean, in Idiot Wind, he sings, you know, I couldn't believe after all these years.
You didn't know me better than that.
Yeah, you didn't know me better than that. And I think this idea that, like, when it comes to the spotlight, you're always a complete unknown. And I mean, ties back into this idea, you know, we talk about Bob Dylan as if we know him. But of course, we only know, you know, what he shows us. And we can only infer from that. But in reality, you know, the actual person is someone who's reserved for his private life, and
rightfully so.
And of course, and that private person is someone that he reserves for someone who he hopes will really know him. And in the Philosophy of Modern Song, he which song is it? If You Don't Know Me By Now, he writes about, you know, a domestic like fight, or, you know, fussing and fighting, and he says, you know, like, you should know me. And like I could like pull up like lots of little interviews where he talks about that.
But I think of it too that, you know, Jason and I talked about this. Nobody except me. I'm a stranger here, and no one sees me.
Exactly.
And I feel that, you know, that's such an honest and, like you say, vulnerable line. And he says, and then he undercuts it, except you. And it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite love songs. But it's just, and I think that's the same thing, a complete unknown, that he feels, you know, that people don't necessarily see him. And that's why that line always resonates with me. Because, and another thing that it does.
You love in vain.
Right,
Well.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that it goes back to poetics, that it's poetry that deals with the universal, and maybe Jungian archetypes, if we're going to kind of pull it into, you know, a little bit more modern. But it may be about his life, but it's also speaking to us in a very, you know, fundamental way, that we've all felt like a stranger in the room, and then someone sees you, and you know, that the phrase now, I feel seen.
Yeah.
You know, and he was saying it 50, 60 years ago, that he felt, you know, unseen, but there's that one person that recognizes who he is, and that's an important thing, and especially if you've been in the spotlight for so long.
And especially when people act like they know you because of...
Or act weird around you. I would be completely awkward, wouldn't you? I wouldn't act like I knew him.
No, I mean, I
wouldn't presume.
It would be such it's a weird dynamic. I mean, it always is, and I don't know. I would hope that I wouldn't be completely awkward, but I probably would be.
I'm awkward on my best days. So.
But you know, but the thing is also, what I think is interesting to me is that it goes both ways, because he has a song, "Tell Me," where he just says, "Tell me, I've got to know," and then he asks her all these questions, and there's a questionnaire, I think from 1986 maybe, from Interview magazine, and he says, you know, what would you say to a woman, you know, that you dating or whatever, and he says, "Tell me everything." And so I think like this idea of knowing one another in a kind of deep way, where you just understand what the other person is about, and that being the fundamental thing that your relationship is based on, I think is beautiful, and but I just think it's interesting that it goes both ways, that it's not just that he wants to be known, you know, but he also wants to know the other person.
So again, the symbiosis. I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to just check to make sure that we didn't mess anything up, or I didn't. It is recording. Wonderful. So really quickly, your essay for Denmark. Our initial conversations were about the crisis of masculinity, and I loved that talk. Such a beautiful break in my day of really, really awful meetings that I got to hang out with you and chat about it. And then you said it's interesting how Dylan gives us these prescriptions or examples of, or he gives men, because we are neither of us is a man, but how to perform masculinity in certain situations. And I want to talk about that, but will you tell me about your paper for Denmark, please?
Well, it started with me being interested in the idea of, you know, the crisis of masculinity, that in the wake of feminism, actually now there have been studies where, you know, a lot of young men are actually doing worse academically than women. Yes. And of course, with the very necessary conversation surrounding toxic masculinity, that I think there is a real need for positive masculine role models. Right. And I think that a lot of boys and young men are gravitating towards, you know, problematic figures like Andrew Tate, or, I mean, even someone like Jordan Peterson, who is a lot less problematic than Andrew Tate, but...
I think even in the U.S. too, the conservative religious masculinity is also has an element of toxicity to it.
Yes, I mean, we were already talking about the kicker from the Chiefs, exactly. Right. So I was just curious how with an artist like Bob Dylan, who's been in the spotlight for so long, you know, where we can really see like the different life stages that he's moved through, and he has documented them and processed them in his songs. So when I sent in my proposal, I was thinking, well, you know, there must be something to be gained from looking at these songs like in that way, like as, you know, models of masculinity. Are they healthy? Question mark. you know, and just, but what can we learn? But then I guess my focus has kind of shifted a little bit because I am interested in, well, what I started writing about is the idea of the hero, and how we see, you know, the hyper masculine models of heroic masculinity in Marvel movies, but I think especially in his most recent songs and other writings, he has drawn so much on ancient epics and on the idea of, you know, basically presenting himself as the hero. And so I was curious how what that says about masculinity, what kind of heroics he's drawn to, and where that leaves gender dynamics in respect of like masculine and feminine. And so that's what my paper will be about.
That's really fascinating.
I hope it will be.
I was thinking about, you know, obviously temporarily like Achilles, you know, and just songs where he's kind of overtly, and I thought of what would Julius Caesar do, not entirely heroic, but
no, but absolutely, absolutely, all of that plays into it. And I think there is also a, to me, the most crucial thing almost is that the one epic hero that he seems to have identified with the most, and he's expressly said that in his Nobel lecture, is Odysseus. And Odysseus, even though he is a great warrior, he has shown strength, really what he is famous for is not his courage, but his wit, his intelligence, and what has gained him immortality in his story, his, you know, kleos, his fame and glory, is not his strength in battle, how many men he's killed, but it's that he returns home, and that he returns to his family. And I think that to me is really, like,
it's fascinating, because then it goes back to what we were talking about before, when I was like, well, he's not, you know, the physical specimen of idealized masculinity, but he is witty, and then also the first thing he says in Scorsese's documentary is he was born very far from home, and you know, we make the joke, if I have a hard time getting home because of traffic or something, like, I am Odysseus today, because I've been diverted so many times. But it does seem like that, because he's reiterated that theme so many times. It's been that he's on his way somewhere,
and he's on the road all the time.
Right.
You know, I mean, he has, decades ago, he is committed to basically a life on the road.
I made up my mind to give myself to you.
Yeah, and I think that's it's on a literal level and on a spiritual level that these journeys kind of play out. But I think especially in the new millennium, he has, I mean, you know, he's in his 80s now. Of course he's thinking about what he leaves behind. And I think the question of legacy and framing that almost in the sense of like ancient epics, to me, is like really fascinating, because he loves those stories. And I mean, and of course, like, for the sake of the conference, you know, these stories really spell out like a vision of masculinity, and it's the men that go out and go into the world and do great deeds, and the women stay at home. But that's not even seen as like a negative thing. That's just how it is, and it's I mean, the way I see it is, you know, it's almost like a sacrifice needs to happen. The men go out and potentially sacrifice their life, like out in the world, protecting, saving, whatever, with being warriors, and the women sacrifice themselves for the family
by protecting the home front.
Yeah, exactly, and give their lives to the children. And I mean, it's
and even the culture, because that's what's maintained. While if we argue, and I did a lot on World War I propaganda, and it plays even to that in World War II, that there's that it becomes a hyper-gendered event, that men go off and they protect through violence and state-sanctioned violence, and the women stay home and protect the culture that those men are fighting for. So it's really two fronts.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's a very traditional model, but I think that's one that does show up in Dylan's work, and I think just because we now understand that, you know, gender is a performance, and, you know, there are lots of different ways of presenting that and so on. I think it's one way of looking at it.
Right.
And I think the way Dylan writes about it is that the role that the women play in culture is a crucial one.
Right.
And I think like one of the, and I'm kind of like spoiling my paper a little bit, but
this is going to happen after your paper.
Okay.
So,
but I think one of the most interesting songs in that context for me, about these two realms of the men going out into the world and trying to advance and trying to innovate and trying to move forward, and the women being a counterpart to that is License to Kill, where it's, you know, man thinks because he rules the earth, he can do with it as he please, you know, and if things don't change soon, he will. But then in the chorus, it's always like, but there's a woman, you know, and she's the one that has the wisdom, and her role is to kind of temper the foolishness that can come along and the selfishness that can come with doing all the advancement, maybe also for the wrong reasons, you know, because it's a selfish pursuit to, you know, want to. I think there's first step was touching the moon. I think there's like a joke that, you know, but then is very critical of anything having to do with space exploration, because he has spoken about that a couple of times. But I do think it's like it's almost like an interesting metaphor, or like it's symbolic in a way that he says, like, you know, but what are we doing out there? You know, like, let's
focus on this planet.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when I teach epics, I teach world history, and one of the questions that the epics that we read, I always ask, you know, what does this tell us about the society that created it? Because epics are upholding the social mores, the cultural, what's accepted culturally, and we look at gender and we look at politics and we look through different lenses. But if this is Dylan creating an epic, then what do you think he's telling us? And we can look at that through the lens of gender. Like, what do you think he's telling us about either, like, or anything? Answer it how you will. I'm not going to micromanage your answer.
Well, I think the way I see it is that this idea that if you pursue fame and glory in some way, it should be for the right reasons, I think is one that's really crucial to, you know, for example, Dylan's last album, Rough and Rowdy Ways. But I think it's also one that's really important in our culture at the moment. You know, it's so easy to get famous, and a lot of people do it just for the sake of being famous. And, you know, we're in the attention economy, and sometimes you have to, you know, some people do some really stupid stuff just to get attention. And I mean, maybe I'm applying this to, you know, maybe this says more about me than our society, is what I'm saying. But I think that that's something that he is really trying to figure out for himself. You know, why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? And I think, I mean, it's probably a lesson that applies at any point in history, but I do think that it's also very pertinent to the moment that we're in at the moment, like right now.
Right. That's really interesting. So we have seen him through almost every age in his adult life, or every age or every period in his adult life. So what are some of the templates or some of the examples that he gives us of maybe positive masculinity? Or negative? I won't micromanage.
Well, I mean, I think it's fascinating, because I think some of his songs are quite open. And I think at some point he probably also tried to avoid writing too much from an autobiographical place, because he was trying to protect that. So I think whatever I say now is probably, again, a reflection of like how I read those things in addition to...
But isn't that the case? And I think that with Dylan, and I loved that you said one way of reading this, because I think that's the beauty of Dylan, is that there are so many ways to enter into reading Dylan, that I always say, I'm fine if I'm wrong. If you disagree with me, this is my perspective, and we can have a discussion about it. So just this is your reading.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the things that I think are templates for masculinity probably transcend gender boundaries, as is so often the case. I really think that what Bob Dylan symbolizes for me as an artist and as a human being as well is this idea of just do what you think you should do. You know, everything passes, everything changes, just do what you think you should do or what you think you must do. He sometimes thinks. And this idea that don't worry too much about what other people think, trust yourself, as he sings, and take care of your own, you know, be grounded in, you know, healthy relationships, and protect that, be protective of that, and then just, you know, follow your own path.
Some people aren't as clear, and that's the thing that I think we discussed, that Susie was very clear that she had a path and it wasn't to support him. And I think sometimes people look at her as a tragic figure, like, oh, she lost out on being with Dylan.
Oh, I don't think she saw it that way.
No, but I'm just saying that from the outside, again, what we put onto her, and we do have her book, but people think, oh, I have read lots of stuff that, like, oh, she was the original girlfriend that he left for Joan Baez, and it makes her seem that there's something lost there. And I don't think she lost in any way, shape, or form, because even, you know, she has such a generosity of spirit. But I wonder, I forget where I was going with this, that I lost my train of thought. We'll chalk it up to jet lag. Yeah, we'll come back. What was I going to say? I don't know. It's gone.
About going down your path.
Oh, that not everybody has that. That idea of, like, this is what I'm focused on, and this is where I want to go. And I think he's also not afraid to burn bridges, maybe, or leave a relationship behind that doesn't.
I think it comes with sacrifices.
Yes.
I think doing what you must do is, you know, both the positive and the negative. Right. You know, and like sometimes it might mean like being ruthless and like cutting some people off when.
And I wonder if it really is ruthless, or if it's, you know, gosh, we're taught to be so generous, and especially but he has a vision. And I always say to my sister, do you see the vision? You know, like, but he knows where he wants to go, and it's up to him, especially now that he carries the expectations of being Bob Dylan, or from the time that he did, that he had to get rid of the folks who weren't going to help him or weren't going to serve that end. And maybe it is ruthless, but
I think
it's for the greater good.
I think
maybe.
Well, sorry, I think I just touched the microphone. I think it depends on how you look at it.
If you're the one being cut out, maybe it's ruthless, right?
And I mean, yeah, it's. I don't know. I think like sometimes in life you have to make like hard decisions, and I think the only way that you can make those decisions without having regrets later on is to do what you think you should do.
Right.
You know? And if you stay true to yourself in those moments, you will probably not regret the decision afterwards.
I wonder if he has any regrets. Only he can answer that, but it's an interesting question. My question was, again, the crisis of, we won't talk about crisis of masculinity. You can edit this out, David. I wonder, talking about cutting people out, and now we can talk a little bit maybe about our, cut that out, please. We can talk about our time in the last show in Austin. All the shows in Austin they were just so special. Yeah. But when Jimmy Ray Vaughan came on the stage, and I remember turning to Court and saying, did Doug just get fired in the middle of the show? Oh. But it did there was a shift, and maybe you can speak to that, in just the attitude on the stage. And I felt it. Did you? Oh, I touched my mic.
I mean, I thought both shows in Austin, I thought both shows in Austin were incredible. And I think sometimes I think like justice for the first Austin show, because it didn't have like the excitement of having a guest musician.
Right.
But
it was so good.
It was so good, and had across the borderline, which was,
I cried.
I mean, that was like one of my highlights.
Yeah.
From any Bob Dylan show that I've seen. That, I mean, and he was right there. It was incredible. Yeah. But yeah, and then
you could see the sparkles off of his pants.
See his feet like underneath the piano. Yeah. But it was crazy when he brought out Jimmy Vaughan, and I mean, I didn't immediately recognize him. I wasn't sure, and I didn't hear the name right, and so it took a while until word kind of got back to me, where someone said, "Oh, it's Jimmy Vaughan." It's like, "Oh my God, it's Jimmy Vaughan." Right. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, in that moment, I just kind of took it as, wow, he brought out a local player for the last night of the tour.
Right.
And I didn't really think about like the implications of what that could mean for the band until afterwards. And I don't know. I mean, I did feel a bit for Doug Lancio, because he didn't get to play the last few songs of the night after being with Dylan for years now and being there for the entire tour. But I mean, we'll see what that means. Because it could have been either him just saying like, "Oh, sorry, we don't need all those guitar players. Right. We'll keep him there." And I think because Jimmy Vaughan had to cancel some shows of his own lately, because I mean, I just saw that he posted a statement on Instagram that he will be canceling the remaining summer shows because he's receiving cancer treatment. Oh no! But it said that it's a curable form of cancer, so hopefully he will make a full recovery.
And what a treat we got to see him too.
Exactly. So and I mean, I would imagine that maybe that played into it as well. Yeah. That Dylan wanted to give him the opportunity to play in his hometown, and that was a really special moment. That's great. And also maybe to boost morale. After for Jimmy Vaughan, who had to cancel his shows, but also for Dylan and the band to have that treat. But I mean, there were some issues with Doug the night before, where Dylan was a bit unhappy. But then, but it could be, I don't know if he got fired or if he was just like, well, and now you're on the naughty step for one show.
Time out.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see.
All right, so maybe this will be the last thing, 'cause, I don't want to run out of tape, but tape. I say tape. I don't want to run out of media. How about that? Okay, so Roberta and I talk about this a lot. I have a thing about Leather Dylan in the 80s. Right? Is there a Dylan that you're particularly like, that's my Dylan? Because I'm going to say there's one picture I sent to Court, and I said, can we please get this for the cover of the 80s book? And he's in a leather vest, and he's got his arms are solid, and I'm like, this is...
Talk about performance of masculinity.
Exactly, that's what I'm getting at. Like, so we're doing now, we're objectifying him, and we're putting him in the object position, and I'm sure he's used to it, but where is there a Dylan that... I mean, because 80s Dylan, Leather Dylan, and Court jokes with me about Leather Dylan. I'm like, I'm sorry, I do love...
When did you get into Dylan? Was it around that time? Was that like the first Dylan that you encountered?
No, I think that, I encountered Dylan through lyrics, because my stepdad gave me the book of lyrics and said, take this, brother, may it serve you well. So and my first encounter with him was 60s Dylan, right. But no, I mean, had I been a 12-year-old looking at him in 86 with his guns out in the leather, I probably would have responded that way.
Well, because I had this idea that maybe the first Dylan that you kind of like come to is, has like a special meaning. I mean, I feel like I have almost like two answers to that. I mean, on the one hand, I think I was always really drawn to like Rolling Thunder Dylan. Like fairly early on, someone gave me the vinyl of Hard Rain, and that to me was just you know, that look that he gives the camera on the cover, and like it's just his face, you know. It's not even like the hair or whatever, you know. It has like none of the markers, you know, like the shades or the curls or whatever. It's just the face, but it's like that piercing look that he gives the camera, and like
the eyes too.
Yeah, exactly. But it's black and white, so you can't even see that they're blue eyes or whatever. So
but still they're light.
yeah. But so Rolling Thunder is you know, a Dylan that I love, you know, and I love the whole look, like with the jacket and the hat and the vest, and you know, it's that's just such a cool look. But I will also say that I have a real soft spot for Love and Theft.
Okay.
For Love and Theft, Bob with the little pencil mustache, with the kind of like, you know, that I think David Garr photo shoot where he's wearing like the pink shirt and like the cowboy hat and so on, because that's, you know, Love and Theft was the first album that came out when I became a Dylan fan. So I think there's just something about joining kind of like the fan community around that time, and so I love that kind of like cowboy Dylan, and then like moving into Masculine Anonymous and
archetypes.
Yeah, I mean, basically it's the Sundance with the blonde wig. That's my Dylan. No, but I mean,
I love that though.
And it is funny. I mean, that all of that stuff kind of happened like as I was just like really going down the rabbit hole with Bob Dylan, and then like you think like, wow, he's such a funny guy, you know. He played like the first time he played Newport Folk Festival since 1965 when he went electric, and he goes up on stage with like a wig and a fake beard. Like, that is wild. Who is this guy, you know? But then
he's a complete unknown.
Yeah, but I think that all of that happened in like my early years as a fan, I think is significant, because it just really showed me like the sense of humor and just that he doesn't take himself too seriously, and it was a great time for his live shows as well. So it's I do have like a really soft spot for like early 2000s Dylan.
Okay, I know I'm 80s Dylan. Give me Dylan in a leather vest.
I mean, it's a strong look. It's a great look with the motorcycle boots, the lace up.
I know, and the earring.
The earring is great. Like, I'm a big fan of the outfit that he wears at the Grammys when he's presenting with Stevie Wonder, and like the blue. I mean, I think 80s Dylan's style is really underrated. I think in general, I think Dylan's style is underrated. I think he's like sartorially, he's got great style, and again, it's the confidence as well. You know, he sometimes wears like outfits that are truly out there, but he always pulls them off. Like, they never wear him. He always wears them, even the wigs.
Even the hoodies.
Yeah. Oh, especially the hoodies.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this with me, inviting me into your studio and donating your time. And this has been great. And I know I said it, this is your perspective, but I always love to hear your perspective, because you have so many wonderful and interesting things to say. And I feel like
thank you.
I'm better for having heard them, so I really appreciate it.
Well, I can very much return the compliment. It's always lovely talking to you.
Thank you. All right, well, so that was my talk with Laura Tenschert. Thank you so much for tuning in, and look for the next episode of Infinity Goes Up on Trial, July 1st. Thanks.